Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet, and welcome to my summer series where I have my stack up videos. Last week I had the bottom tier stack up video for the bottom 4 teams. This week I will be going through the mid tiers stack up, so I'll have the mid 4 constructors, and next week I will have the top 4 constructors and how they stack up. So if you haven't seen my bottom tier stack up video, I would suggest that you go and look at that before you come into the mid tier, so you have an idea of where all those line up, and you can get a better idea how the mid-tier teams are stacking up as well. But if you're just looking for a specific team, you're of course welcome to watch that video by itself. As I said, we'll have a little bit of overlap. So you can see here that we have Steak Kick at that bottom ranking of 7th on the constructor standings, and they were included last week as they will be included this week, just to give you an overall concept of where that overlap resides and how those teams are coming up into the mid-tier section. So we have Steak F1 at 7th, we have Aston Martin at 6, and we have Williams at 5, and of course Red Bull up there in that 4th constructor's position. And as I said last week, Steak F1 had an average starting position of 15 and an average finishing position of 13 with 4 DNFs. So they can, gaining ground between their, qualifying sessions during the race to the finishing position. So they're actually getting better as the race goes on. So that's always a good plus. They just need to work on their qualifying to help them get there to start off with, so they can hopefully get up closer to those points on a more regular basis. Now, if we saw last week, they are getting much better as this season is progressing. So at this summer break session, they're on an upward swing. So if they continue that as the rest of the season goes on, we will see them climb up in this constructor standing as well. This gives us to Aston Martin, which is right ahead of Steak Kick in that 6th position. They have an average starting position of 13 and an average finishing position of 13. And they have 3 DNFs, and I put this one in this brackets because it was where Stroll did actually not start the race or did not compete in the race at all due to his hand issues that he had earlier in the season or last season, in that regard of having that wreck and just damaging his hands, and so he felt like it wasn't able to go, and so no one actually drove for his car in that race. And so it's kind of an outlier in that, but it still didn't get them anywhere close to the points, and so that's why I have it included in that DNF marker. Then we come to Williams, who is in 5th standing position, who has an average starting position of 11th, so a couple of spots higher than Aston Martin, and they have an average finishing position of 12th. So they're losing a position overall during the race, but they're still getting up there ahead of the teams behind them and getting that closer to that point range into that that 10th position. So they're getting those points on one-offs in there, so they get that closer to the average there to get those points. So that's a good thing. They just need to work on getting a little bit more consistent so that they can get up in that 10th position more regularly. They also have 6 DNF, so that's a pretty high DNF count for halfway through the season. So they've had a lot of issues in those cars, knocking them out in this run. So if they can limit that, they will probably have a better chance in the second half of the season as well, getting back up in the points, even though they have a pretty good solid foundation in that 5th standing position. And then we come to Red Bull, who's in that mid-tier session, which is kind of surprising because they're in 4th instead of where we expect them to see them in that 1st position. They have an average starting position of 9 and an average finishing position of 9. And they have 3 DNFs. And of course, you have to kind of take this with a grain of salt, as most of that is due to Max Verstappen pushing them up, whereas that second driver in that Red Bull has not come close to where he is in these races. And so he's pretty much all in the hands of Max Verstappen for that Red Bull. So you have to kind of figure out how that's going to play out in these races and these comparisons. So you can kind of get a better gauge on that team if they had a better second driver, or that second driver had a better feel in most cases, so they could get the most out of that Red Bull. So here we can see the teams and their drivers and how they compare to each other and the teams around them as well. So you have, of course, in green we have the Steak F1 Sauber car, and in that darker green we have that that Aston Martin green of Lance Stroll and Fernando Alonso. In the blue have Carlos Sainz and Alexander Albon, of course, in the Williams. And in the red, we have Yuki Tsunoda and Max Verstappen in that Red Bull. So you can kind of look at those and kind of get a gauge on how those teams' drivers are compared to each other and the teams around them as well, those drivers in those mid-tier teams. So, of course, we have Gabriel Borletto's standing is in 17th in the driver standings. His average finishing position is 14, and his average starting position is 15 with 3 DNFs. So he's getting one spot better in the race, which is always a good sign, getting that a little bit better, a little bit extra out of it. If he can get that qualifying session up, he'll be a little bit closer to those points on a more regular basis, so that's good to see. And, of course, if you compare that to his teammate, Nico Hülkenberg, who's now in that standing of 9th position with the driver standing, his average starting position is one spot behind his teammate in that 16th position, but, of course, his average finishing position is in 12th, so much higher, 2 positions higher than his teammate and much higher than his starting position. So he's having a little bit of trouble there with his qualifying session, but can gain the ground in the race. And, of course, he only has 1 DNF, so he has that more chances so far in the season to get those points than his teammate has. So I'll figure out how that plays out in this second half of the season, but you can get the gauge there, just a quick synopsis from last week. Then we come to the Aston Martins. We have Lance Stroll starting off in that 12th position, and his teammate is just 1 spot ahead of him in that 11th position. So Stroll's average starting position is 15, and his average finishing position is 13. And, of course, he had that one race that he didn't start, so that kind of marks that in that parentheses there for him. Where his teammate, the average starting position is in 11th, and his average finishing position is in 12th. So you can see those 2 team members there, where Lance getting better throughout the race, and his teammate's getting 1 spot lower, but he's starting up there and has that better chance of starting in that higher position, so he has a better chance of finishing in the higher position, getting those points when things kind of go awry, but dropping back in the normal races. So you can kind of look at that average, and, of course, it's very surprising me in this look as we consider all the struggles that Fernando has had, and you can see that a little bit later in the graphs, that he is that much ahead of his teammates still in these statistics as these starting positions and these finishing positions as they come through this. So that was an interesting spot for me to look at and kind of figure out how that Aston Martin is going to play out in the second half of the season. Then we come to Carlos Sainz, who came into the Williams team and he was putting a lot of pressure on Alexander Albon, but his teammate is, shining quite brightly as he has stepped up his game and is doing really well. So you have Carlos in that 16th driver standing position, where his teammate and Alex is now in 8th. So quite a bit ahead of his teammate in that Williams. Now Carlos' starting position is in 12th, and his average finishing position is in 13, and they both have 3 DNFs. So he's lagging behind his teammate a little bit, trying to get a grip on how that Williams drives and how the balance is to get the most out of that Williams. And I think he's starting to come around to figure out the best part of that Williams car, but he still has a long ways to go to get to where his teammate is. So we'll have to see if that plays out in the second half of the season, or if Alexander Albon will continue to outshine him this season. We'll have to wait till the rules changes before we get a good look at both of them and how they compare to each other. Now, Alexander Albon is starting up there in that 10th and averaging a finishing position of 10th. So he's right there at that bottom part of that points, which is always good. And then he can sneak up there a little, get extra points, and sometimes and then drop out of the points as well. But getting those points more on an average basis is always a good thing. So that shows you why the Williams is so far up in the constructors' standings overall. Then we come to the Red Bull. We have Yuki Tsunoda, whose standing is in 18th, so quite a bit back from his teammate in 3rd. He has kind of jumped in there at the last minute in that Red Bull after 2 races of the season, trying to get the grips on that Red Bull. So he's still struggling, trying to figure out that average and how that Red Bull is on a knife edge and get the most out of that Red Bull in his driving style. Now, his average starting position so far is in 14th, and his average finishing position is in 14th as well. They both have 1 DNF, so there's not really anything to compare there against besides they are even. But we can see that Yuki is struggling a lot in that Red Bull compared to his teammate, not quite getting up there near the points as they would have liked. Now, I understand that they would prefer someone right alongside of Max, but I think they would be more satisfied even if they weren't there, if they were closer to those points and getting more points on a regular basis, helping that Red Bull in the constructors standings. As right now, it all appears to be Max's points that are making it to the constructor standings in that regard. And speaking of Max, of course, he's in that third position for the driver standings. And I know he's struggling in that Red Bull this season as well, only down in third for the drivers constructors instead of that first marker that he was in so handily last season. His average starting position is in third, and his average finishing position is in fifth. So he's actually dropped back a couple of spots on average in this race, in this season, which is really hard to understand because we always expect him to be up front, and we see him coming from the back of the field up to the front of the field. But in average, that kind of plays out as well. It gets harder to get those averages as you get to the top of the field to maintain those top level positions. So you have to take that into effect and figure out where he is. And so far, because of Lando and Oscar always taking up most of those top positions, and then you got Mercedes and the Ferraris kind of coming in on occasion. So he's dropped back to that fifth position for finishing position on average, which is still a good position, but it's not quite where they need to be, especially with his teammate dropping back so far, behind him for that Red Bull to be up there competing in the constructors standings as they would like. But still up there into that seventh position overall for the constructor standings. And of course, he's in that third for that driver standings. And of course, as we saw last week, we see the comparison between the stake drivers here with Nico Hulkenberg in green and Gabriel in red. And of course, this is showing the bottom of the graph here is in that first or zero position as we go through each race. So the lower you get on this graph, the better. And of course, you see these trend lines for each driver getting better throughout this first half of the season, which is always a good sign, showing them that they are progressing, getting farther up in the field, getting closer to those points on an average. So both of those are good. And of course, we see Nico Hulkenberg ahead of his teammate quite significantly, but that gap is narrowing down quite severely at the end of this first half of the season. So to see if Gabriel Barolato can kind of come back and put a lot of pressure on his more experienced teammate, Nico Hulkenberg, in the second half of this season. And of course, we see a little bit more erratic positions for Nico Hulkenberg, which I think is him able to take some of the advantage out of that Sauber car, but also, when things go bad, it seems to go quite seriously bad for him in getting those situations. Whereas Gabriel Barolato is more stable, not quite pushing it to that knife edge, and so he's getting more stable positions out of it, but not gaining those really advantages out of those situations that potentially he could, but of course not falling back because of those situations that are going to go wrong as well. Here we see the Aston Martin drivers. We see, of course, Lance Stroll in that green, and I put Fernando Alonso in that yellow. So we can see those trend lines where Lance Stroll is a little bit more steady, a little bit more level on that trend line, so not getting quite as well throughout the season. He's still gaining some ground, but not quite as fast as his teammate is. Now, his teammate started off kind of poorly, but he's kind of going back and forth with some of the issues with that Aston Martin, but it's continually getting ahead of his teammate in most of these races, as you can see through this graph, and is a little bit more consistent on, farther up in the field in those closer to the point range than his teammate is as well. So we'll have to see how that plays out and how that kind of goes through. And of course, we have that break in Lance Stroll's run because he decided not to race in that Spain race as well. So we'll have to see how that plays out. If his hands are going to continue to give him issues, or if that was like a one-time off thing for him and he's gotten those rehabilitated so that he can drive the rest of this season. And here we see Carlos Sainz in that dark blue and Alexander Albon in that light blue. And of course, both of their trend lines are going up, which is a bad thing. That means they're not getting as well in those runnings the farther the season has progressed. So we'll have to see if that is a trend that continues on in the second half of the season, or if they can turn that around and get the updates they need in that Williams to get the stability out of it so that they can continue on and get those points and maintain the positions, or maybe even go a little bit farther up in the constructors standings. As you can see here, of course, Carlos Sainz has started off fairly poorly in this season, trying to get a grips on that Williams, trying to learn that Williams and how that team operates, and to get the most out of that Williams, as he was used to that Ferrari last season. And we can see that Alexander Albon has actually stepped up and really done really well at the beginning of the season, getting up there in that 5th position quite often, and had some bad races more at the end, with a couple of decent ones if you catch up with Belgium and potentially Great Britain. But as overall, they're kind of falling back as the season progresses, so we'll have to see if that's just the other teams that are gaining ground on Williams and they're kind of switch gears and start looking at next year's car, or if they'll continue to put some effort into this car to see if they can get those updates to get them continued into that position that they are in for the constructor standings. And we'll have to see if Carlos Sainz gets a better grip and starts putting more pressure on his teammate as well. And here we can see the true difference between those two Red Bull drivers of Yuki Tsunoda in that light blue and Max Verstappen in that dark blue. And of course I threw in Liam Lawson in that pink as he did the first 2 races for Red Bull, just to give you an idea how those compare as well, and give you a little bit more of a continuous line for comparison against Max in that running, as those second driver switched seats on that 3rd race for this season. As you can see, looking at these, they're both getting worse as the season has progressed. So that Red Bull has fallen back into the clutches of some of the other teams around them, and they're kind of falling back from those top tier constructor standings, dropping into that mid-tier pack. So that's going to be kind of a concern as we go through this second half of the season. I think they've already switched their gears to really concentrate on next year's car, as all those regulations have changed, and so they're trying to put some effort in there to start off a little bit more on par with the rest of the constructors, and maybe get a grip and get an edge on them as well. But you can see here that Max had that really bad race in Austria, but otherwise has done fairly well, always staying in the points, even on his bad days, getting to that 10th position for most of those bad days in his racing, but mainly up there closer to the front of the pack, really pushing the edge and really putting a lot of pressure on Yuki Tsunoda in these runs to see if he can get up there even close to his teammate. But it's kind of interesting to look to see where you can kind of tell which races, when we get to the top tier teams, of how those cars are good at certain races and bad at others, as you see the more comparison between the 2 drivers as they drop back, and so they don't have as much gap between them in that running. So you can see the parallels of how they perform, even if one driver is better than the other. And again, here's a bar graph of where the teams have earned those points throughout this first half of the season. As we see Red Bull in red, Williams in blue, Aston Martin in green in that 6th position, and of course Stake F1 Sauber in that yellow in the 7th constructor standing. So you can see how those progress throughout this first half of the season, and you can look at those trend lines. In this case, the more points you have, the better. So as those downward trend lines are bad this time, you want to see those upward trend lines. So you can see that Red Bull and Williams are going down, so they're kind of getting worse throughout the season, where we see Aston Martin and Stake getting better throughout the season, so they're gaining some ground on those teams around them. The question is will it be enough to make those differences throughout the second half of the season, or will they stay in the same positions due to the points difference that has already occurred in the first half of the season? But it's kind of interesting to see how Red Bull has started off really kind of strong, and it's kind of gotten weak as that goes through. You can see those big point bars at the beginning, and it's kind of tailed off as we go throughout this first half. And Williams has kind of had a mixture, but had a little bit more for the mid part of this first half of the season. They had a pretty good run, but they've had a little bit of a run in the beginning as well, but had those dips in the middle. And so far in the end, they haven't really portrayed as well as they would have liked. So that's kind of interesting to see. And of course, we have Aston Martin starting off strong, having that mid-season, which is horrible, and then coming back where they're starting to get points again. So they'll have to see how that plays out, if they're still up on the upward swing for the second half of the season, or if they'll go back into one of these dips. And of course, Stake kind of following along Aston Martin's path but not quite as strong at the end, dropping them back into that 7th position over that 6th that Aston Martin is in. And here you can see that same information just put in that step graph that's added up over the season. So you can see that giant gap that Red Bull is pulling out on those mid-tier teams. So they're just at that edge, but they're from that mid-tier, but they're very at the top of that with significant margin, getting close to that top-tier team. And we'll see that next week. But of course, we can see the Williams starting off and gaining some ground in the middle section, but kind of leveling off and kind of plateauing throughout this season so far. So they'll have to see how that plays out. And of course, with Aston Martin and Stake coming back, at that Spain issue, gaining ground through the rest of that, first half of the season on that upward momentum. As you can see, getting closer to Williams. So we'll have to see if Williams can maintain that constructor's position, or if they'll get overtaken by one or both of those teams in the second half of the season. And that gets us through our mid-tier stack up for those mid-tier teams and drivers. So what happens next week? We will have our top tier. So we'll take the top 4 teams and their drivers and compare them like we did this week and see how they line up, and kind of give you an overall picture of all the teams this season so far to this summer break. And we'll have to play it all back at the end of the season and kind of figure out where they end up after the second half of the season and see if they've gained ground or lost ground in this running. And I'll have a little bit more detail at the end of the season, comparing each driver to the drivers around them in the final driver standings. So until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.